If this account matters to you, stay to the end, and remember the names that otherwise might be reduced to wax and ledger. Subscribe and like to keep small lives from disappearing into the stacks. Wax melted into the hollow at Catherine's wrist. The lamp oil stung the back of her throat. 3 doors stood between the quay and whatever waited beyond them. The outer gate with its rusted hinge, the carved door into the processing chamber, and the narrow hatch that led down beneath the caravans where the clerks kept their tablets. She had learned, before she could count weeks, how to read the creak of each hinge as counsel. Hinge 1 meant a brief, bright noon at the market. Hinge 2 meant the slow, businesslike scrutiny of a steward's hand. Hinge 3 meant the ledger room, where names entered into wax became something else entirely. She was 22 when she crossed those thresholds in earnest. Before that, she had threads of another life. A stall with figs, and a father's wide palm that taught her bargaining as if truth were a weight one set and reset. Her mother had been taken one winter of long rains, when borders shuttered and men with new badges came through the market lanes. Catherine could still see, in the sweep of a trader's cloak, the sudden emptiness where a woman had stood. Those memories lay like a small blue shard in the palm of her mind, a bowl rimmed with glaze, a tongue of laughter. She carried them without ceremony, pressing them into the private tablet she had carved from bark and slate, writing names and fragments in the language she had been taught to fold into neat lines. They called the place the processing chamber, as if naming could make violence administrative and therefore bearable. It was under the caravans, where the smell of sea and animal fat mixed with the acid tang of wax and the dust that never quite settled. Men in plain tunics set down their packs and took on the shape of office. Measured movements, stamps that fell with the decisive sound of a hammer, fingers that left ink and impressions to prove something that neither heat nor hunger could erase. Women like Catherine were catalogued in schedules and rosters as if they were measures of cloth: length, use, duty, night shift. Sometimes, when a clerk frowned, a whole human history could be reduced to a line. Transferred to household X for service, noted as Christian, age recorded. And Catherine would feel her life hinge on the exactness of those few words. They did not tell her, when they first closed the door, what her future name in the ledger would be. She found instead the work of learning how to become a thing that could be shifted with a stamp. Sophia had been appointed as trainer, a willowy woman with a precise economy of movement, a voice that gave little away. Sophia taught by example. Fold so the crease is exact. Burn the edge of cloth so it does not fray. Set the seal with pressure, and do not hesitate. She had been here longer than most, and wore her survival as if it were a second skin. "No anger in your hams," she told Catherine once, arranging linen on a pallet. "Anger leaves uneven creases. The steward notices uneven creases." Training lasted 8 weeks. The ledger spoke in numbers, and Catherine learned to answer in tasks. Each week was a small unit of time, given and taken away. Each week had its own weight and shape. Week 1 arrived with a roster of names and the first lesson on seal making. They showed her the wax, how it came in raw lumps and was warmed until it held a gloss, how the seal must be pressed while the wax still sang. Her first attempts left thumbprints that read like confessions. Sophia did not scold. She adjusted Catherine's fingers until the smear became a clear impression of the household's emblem. The emblem was a tree with 3 branches. 3 doors, Sophia murmured, tapping the carved roots. Remember the roots. Everything rests on them. Week 2 taught the ledger's patience. Catherine spent cold mornings by a clerk whose lips moved as he read aloud the columns of arrivals and departures. Mortality was a column in the ledger, so was sickness, so were reasons left vague. Night duty, removed for inspection, absent without leave. The clerk's voice was a measuring stick. When you cannot be counted, you do not exist in law, he said once, more to the tablet than to them. Catherine copied the letters in the margin so often that the strokes became a second language beneath her skin. Week 3 became the practice of standing in quiet rooms when higher men came. They were always fewer in number than the small army of routines that formed the household. One day a steward entered with a satchel of seals. He moved with the casual authority of someone who believed that the world was, by right, organized into ledgers. He showed them how to fold petitions into small packets and bind them with thongs. And his thumb left a bruise on the leather that matched the impression of the seal. Catherine watched the way he lowered his voice to consult a clerk about the precise ink to use. Even authority had its rituals of anxiety. Week 4 brought the novices from the docks. Zara was as thin as a drawn bow and wore her fear naked on her face. Amina had the stubborn set of someone who would not break but could be bent. Catherine appointed herself, quietly, to the work of watching edges, smoothing a loose thread in Zara's hem, slipping a scrap of bread into Amina's palm. At night she kept their names on her private tablet. Catherine, Zara, Amina, each written in the cramped, neat script that felt most like prayer. The private tablet was small, folded, and kept beneath her mattress. She drew it out when the lamp oil warmed the room to read the names as if they were charms against disappearance. Week 5 demanded mastery of household timings. The roster was a living pulse. Who rose before dawn, who cleaned the bowls, who lay out the mats for visitors. Catherine learned to read the roster like a map. She learned the soft ways to shift a name. A gentle cough at mealtime, so the steward would think of a sick woman. A misplaced ladle that required Zara to remain near the kitchen instead of on the roster for night duty. These were acts of measured obstruction. They were small. They were dangerous. Week 6 was the lesson of the mirror. The household provided mirrors for the women to maintain themselves. The glass was not clear. It held a haze that reflected more the lamp smoke than a face. Catherine learned to use the mirror as instruction in the politics of appearance. Sophia showed her how to comb hair so it lay without drawing attention, how to tilt the head so that the neck's bearing looked dutiful rather than proud. They read you before they read the tablet, Sophia said. Learn how to be read as harmless. Week 7 introduced the dear hums, the small tokens slipped between hands, a coin or a scrap of cloth, a hummed melody traded in the dark that meant, I remember you. These small currencies had no place in formal record, but where else did value exist? Catherine accumulated them in a corner of her bedding, a slender strip of blue thread shaped into a tiny deer, a coin with a hole bored through for string. Sometimes she traded a hum for a quiet favor, a roster swap, a loaf of bread, a whispered warning of which patrol would sweep the lanes. Week 8 condensed all prior tasks into performance. That week they rehearsed the act of coming and going, the ritual of folding petitions, the way to attach a seal so that the wax cooled without flaking. Catherine's hands had learned a new language. She could now press wax into a precise image without a tremor. She could set a ledger line that did not invite dispute. The final test was simple. A steward would come, inspect a roll call, and note which names warranted retention and which could be offered to another household. Catherine passed by being methodical and by hiding enough small resistances in plain sight. Her placement followed, into a household set with cushions for visitors, a steward's office with racks of tablets, a table scarred by knives where meals were rations and gestures of power. The steward was called Amir Kalawan by those who worked nearest him. He was known to the clerks as steady as a quill. His ledger was the house's heart. He wore his indifference like a cloak, but he was not without form. He insisted on stamped receipts for every transfer, and he liked the precision of lists. In his presence, Catherine learned to shape her voice like a practiced coin, so that it slid against queries without making abrasive noise. Life in the household was a rhythm of small tasks that could, in other hands, be softened into something like survival.
System. Catherine's days were filled with folding linen, keeping inventory of oil and salt, teaching new novices to read the simple loops of letters that marked their names in the ledger. She taught because to be useful was to be noticed as necessary and not merely as property. She taught because when she pressed a reed into the palm of a frightened girl and showed the curl that made an ah sound, she saw in that small certainty a kind of defiance. Sophia watched these lessons with an expression that was sometimes almost a smile and sometimes a closed mouth. The household's claims reached into the most intimate hours. There were things recorded as night duties in the ledger that never bore further detail. Night duty could mean an assigned watch by the courtyard, a duty to attend to candlelight, or an imprecise duty assigned to satisfy purposes no law would write plainly. Those words were used as a veil. They allowed the house to maintain an account while erasing the form of what had occurred. Catherine learned to treat night duty as a secret language. She learned how to move when such duties were called, to shift another woman's roster by prearranging a small spill, to keep a hand on a shoulder as if in consolation when the night shifted away toward the steward's private rooms. Complicity took shape in these small moves. Sophia, who had taught Catherine everything about seals and creases, also taught the art of silence. Once, when a clerk asked of a woman's absence, Sophia answered in the ledger's language, transferred, and rinsed a bowl so the clerk's question dissolved into steam. In that way, the household preserved itself. The system fed on the soft compromises of its keepers. Catherine found herself both protecting and enabling, a caretaker whose acts of protection made the very structure she undermined continue. There were nights when Catherine lay on the pallet and wrote names in the small private tablet by the glow of a pinched wick. She wrote names of those she had sheltered from roster shifts, names of those who had given her a dirham when storms took their food, names of those whose hands had smoothed the fold of her hem when a steward's boot had come near. Each name felt like a small rebellion. She could not, by writing, change the ledger, but she could keep a secret register. She could remember. She called this book the Folded Record. No one in the household knew of it. It was not a petition. It was not a law. It was memory in the form of names. Among the novices, she cultivated small habits of survival. She taught Zara how to slow her breathing when the steward paced, and Amina how to arrange her hands so they would not tremble while stirring broth. She learned, in time, how to read the steward's footfall by the angle of the door or the hush that preceded his step. She organized roster swaps in the weave of daily labor. A cloth misplaced here, an apron slightly stained there, the right flinch at the right time.
These were invisible maps of escape. They never left the household, but they allowed someone else to breathe. There were days when she could feel the ledger pressing against her. The steward would open it, fingers splayed, and trace lines as if reading a psalm. He would speak of categories, Christian, age noted, skilled at folding, and Catherine would feel herself become a point on a grid. Once, during a feast, the steward recited aloud an exception from a higher house, the kind that reached into the roster and plucked it. A woman was to be moved to a Cadiz household for service of the harem, the jarring phrase sitting oddly in the steward's mouth like a stone. The clerks shifted their pens. The steward's face remained smooth. Catherine understood then that the ledger did not just describe the world, it remade it. The petition for manumission was not sudden. It grew as a thin idea, like sap in the rind of a tree, pushed by small acts and the slow accumulation of favors. Often petitions were the preserve of those with wealth or connection. A satchel of coin could loosen a name from a household. Catherine had no coin. She had, instead, the changed fortunes of those she had taught and the small favors she had brokered. A seamed hand, a returned robe, a note slipped into a steward's satchel by a clerk who owed her more than he should have. These were the currency she collected. She began to put together a case not in the language of law, but in the language of service. Receipts, lists of labor, names of those who vouched that she had held a kitchen and taught novices and mended linens until their threads gave no more. She learned how to fold a petition as if folding an offering. Edges exact, ink dark, the signatures of those who could speak routed into a small parcel. The petition would be taken to the Kati, the official who oversaw such matters, whose duty was to translate between household practice and public record. They said he moved like a judge of old stories, half in the worship of ritual. Catherine had seen the Kati once before, a man whose seal fell with a small finality, whose thumbprint carried the authority to reorder names. She feared his smooth voice. She feared the room where petitions took on the solemnity of law. Before the petition could be placed, there were shifts. A new steward arrived at the household across the alley, bringing new rosters and a different appetite for details. Catherine used the shuffle to press small advantages. A misunderstanding in the inventory that required Amina's presence in the storeroom rather than on a night roster. A delivery note misread that kept Zara busy in the yard.
These were not heroic acts. They were small softenings of edges. They kept some bodies from being moved into spaces from which they might not return.
When at last the petition was placed, it moved in stages. Receipt at the steward's hand, a clerk's marginal note, a satchel bearing seals, then the cotty's chamber, where sound fell into the hush that signals official business. Catherine watched the satchel close, the wax catch the room's light and harden, and felt the small weight of hope and dread, as if they were joined in one thing. Sophia stood at her shoulder in the act of leaving a way open, showing solidarity without spectacle. "Hold the crease," she whispered. "When they ask what you did, say only what you can prove." The chamber where petitions were read smelled of old wax and leather. The cotty sat on a raised bench with his own seal beside him. His robe had many folds. His face had the indifference of someone who had learned that compassion could break the system that fed his authority. Clerks read lists aloud. A simple syllable could change a life's tally. The steward presented the petition, Catherine's name tucked among receipts and witness marks. The cotty's thumb left an impression on the wax. Silence fell, as if the room itself were closing like a fist. What struck Catherine was the ritual of it, the slow lowering of the satchel, the clerk's measured tones, the steward's practiced patience, even the way the cotty tapped the tablet, as if testing which lines held. It was a performance precisely because of its banality. The apparatus of law made cruelty seem reasonable. Yet within that hour, legality and mercy braided in a way that left her breathless. The cotty adjourned for consultation, his gesture small but decisive, and the clerks bent to their tablets. Catherine's hands, which had only ever pressed wax under duress, shook now for a different reason, an expectant fear. The decision did not arrive as thunder. It arrived as a small folded pronouncement in wax. Her manumission, if formally granted, would be recorded and stamped, releasing her in law. But legal freedom did not promise streets that would welcome her, or markets that would forget the ledger's earlier entries. It promised, however, a piece of paper that carried the cotty's thumbprint, a physical, cold proof that could be shown when needed. It was a technical severing, precise and decisive, but the household's memory held faster than a seal. After the cotty's deliberation, a clerk came to the household with a satchel and a steady hand. The steward opened it and set a small packet on the table. Catherine unfolded the wax and found her name, a clear impression of a seal, and a line that read, in ink that smelled of iron, that she was now free. The word made a small rumble in her chest. Others in the room shifted as if they had been holding their breath for the same length she had. Sophia gave her a look that combined relief and the wary understanding that a legal change did not unfix the world. The day they recorded her manumission, Catherine walked to the market as if learning the routes again. She moved through lanes that still carried the echo of her mother's laughter in the way the fishmongers set their scales. She breathed the market's wet air and felt the ledger's language follow at a distance. She purchased, with a few coins that had changed hands through favors and subtle accounts, a modest blue glazed bowl. The bowl was not a proclamation. It was a token, small, domestic, something she could put food into and call it her own. The glaze shone like a memory of sea.
When she placed it on a shelf, it seemed to claim a corner of the world not written by a clerk's hand. Manumission altered certain relationships immediately and others slowly. The steward no longer listed her as available in the roster, but neighbors still looked at her with the knowledge of past categories. Some doors that had been open to her while she was dependent on the household's labor now gave way to suspicion. Others, surprisingly, closed in ways that protected her. She continued to visit the folding room, to help novices with their letters. Freedom complicated her choices rather than erasing them. She could leave the house in law. She could not leave the memory of the ledger that had shaped her. Where she had once covertly moved names within rosters, she now used the same skills to secure work for others in places less perilous. A seamstress's corner, a laundress's stall at the market. Her acts were no longer purely clandestine. They were negotiations that required her to trade the last of her dirhams. In the quiet of nights, she continued to update her private tablet. The folded record grew, names stacked in neat lines, short notes of favors, small codes that meant more than the letters could hold. There were, among the entries, the subtle marks of what she refused to write plainly. The shorthand of night duty crossed out and replaced with the word watched in her script. The initial of a woman she had persuaded a clerk to move from a night roster to a day roster by claiming an illness. Each entry was a map of what she had done and of those she had kept from vanishing into the ledger's indifferent grammar. Her maneuvers did not escape the notice of everyone. Once, a clerk whom she had helped with a favor, a neat repair to his sleeve, took a risk and spoke to a visiting magistrate about the irregularities in roster assignments. He framed the irregularities as poor record-keeping rather than as protection. The magistrate listened, then crossed a line in his tablet indicating an inquiry. In the months that followed, a new form of scrutiny settled over the household. Audits arrived, not the modern sort, but a precise inventory of people and their tasks, delivered by a man who carried a stack of wax tablets and a belt heavy with seals. The audit's language borrowed the ledger's calm voice, yet carried a different weight. It was not a kindness. It was the law's way of policing its own margins. The audit found certain discrepancies and wrote them down.
System. Maintain a flow and the connection. Connect with different weight. It was not a kindness. It was the law's way of policing its own margins. The audit found certain discrepancies and wrote them down. Some names were moved, others found their rosters tightened. Catherine's own signature appeared in a clerk's marginal note where she had certified a transfer that would keep a woman from the most dangerous nights. The clerk's handwriting was looser than his usual script, as if the ink had been applied in haste or in fear. There was, in the audit, a single column: Protective Measures, Unofficial. The words were small. They were also, for those who knew how to read between the lines, an admission. Sophia's face, when the audit came, folded into something like concern. "They will ask for evidence," she said, arranging the linens as if the act of folding could flatten a crisis. "You will tell them only the ledger's truth." Catherine had to decide then whether to reveal the private tablet that listed the names she had kept. Revealing it might expose others to retribution. Hiding it might let the legal inquiry break open like a wound into unintended places. She chose, for a while, to keep the tablet private. In the months after manumission, Catherine took on the quiet work of building a small network. She secured a place to sleep in a yard that belonged to a woman who mended cloaks by day.
She traded lessons in reading for a share of bread. She brokered small exchanges between households. Her life became a weave of favors and formalities. She learned to accept the ambiguity of a life stitched between law and custom. Sometimes the law protected her. Sometimes the law was the thin blade that separated someone from all she had. There were nights when she visited the processing chamber to see how the new clerks worked. She liked the rhythm of the wax and the way a seal could announce a human being's change of status. She felt, paradoxically, a kind of kinship with the clerks. They were technicians of memory, after all. But she also recognized that the ledger's order made certain harms possible by naming them as neutral acts. She watched a clerk mark "transferred for oversight" and saw how language could smooth the rough edges of a decision that had violence in its bones. One winter evening, a young novice arrived who had come from the border where Catherine's mother had been taken. The girl's name was Marit. She held a small knot of cloth and a fierce look that did not suit the roles she had been asked to play. Catherine took her hand and guided it toward the private tablet. "Write your name," she said, as if the act were a sacrament. Marit wrote, her letters jagged but true. Catherine added a small mark beside the name to indicate that Marit had been sheltered twice by another woman in the market. "Remember," Catherine told her softly, "names are what keep us from being swallowed." News traveled in thin ribbons. Men who came and went left impressions on the ledger that thrummed like a second pulse in the town. There were whispers of raids and of new policies that tightened the hand of the Coty's office.
A rumor that certain households would be requisitioned for more service spread like a gust through the market. Catherine's work slowed to a careful watch. She began to place names not only to preserve a single life, but to reroute people away from the worst of the household's edges. Sometimes she failed. Sometimes a name she could not save left for a place from which letters did not return. The ledger swallowed them into columns of absence. The great test came when a petition from another household reached the Coty, claiming jurisdiction over a group of women who had been charged with relief of the household. The phrase came across as bland and lawful, but the women it claimed were the most vulnerable of the docks. The Coty scheduled a public audience, a formal sitting where petitions would be weighed against the household's claims. For Catherine, the day of the audience was a slow unspooling of sound and touch. The hall where the Coty sat was lined with tapestries that softened footsteps. Light came through small windows, and the air held the smell of cedar. On the bench, the Coty sat with his leather tablets stacked like sleeping birds. Clerks read aloud lists as if reciting lines in a ritual play. The steward of Catherine's household carried his ledger folded like armor. Catherine stood among a small group who had gathered to witness. She held the private tablet in a fold beneath her robe, the edges of names pressing against her ribs. Sophia was there, her posture the quiet support of a person who had kept surviving and taught others to do the same. The hall hummed with the hush of people waiting to see how law would pronounce on human matter. When the clerk lifted the petition, his voice was precise. He read the household's claims, their receipts, their reasons, and then the petitioners' names. The Coty listened, his face a slow-moving relief, his thumb ready to shape wax. The steward's voice was a near whisper as he recited what the ledger said about those in question.
Catherine watched the ritual gestures, the way the cotty lifted a cloth to check a seal, the way his thumb found the pressure required to sign a name into a new reality. The audience's silence pressed against Catherine as tight as any bound ledger. Her hands were steady. In other times, she had hidden her heart's quickness. Here, she felt it like the quickness of a pulse in a neck. The clerk read, the cotty tapped, small acts of bureaucracy. And then the cotty leaned forward and said something that landed like a stone in water, that he required further evidence, that matters of such gravity demanded testimony. A call went out for witnesses, and Catherine felt the landscape shift beneath her feet. This was the moment when the ritual of procedure could either make law into mercy or reshape it into a kinder cruelty. She had only small testimonies to offer, folded receipts, a clerk's hastily written line, the marks beside names on her private tablet.
But the act of naming. Still, in the dim hours, she would sit by the lamp and touch the glaze of her bowl, feeling its coolness like a small proof that things could be owned and held without being reduced to a ledger's line. She would fold her private tablet and place it between the folds of her shift, carrying memory beneath her clothing as one carries a map. The ledger remained the larger story. It continued to feed the engine of a society that translated people into categories, duties into neutral phrases. But Catherine learned to work inside that engine, bending it with quiet acts. She was careful not to imagine purity where there was only strategy. She understood the moral ambiguity of her choices. That to ensure another's survival, she might have to accept small elements of the system's logic. She accepted these because the alternative was immediate harm or loss. In time, the household's tally would record Catherine as a free woman who taught novices and mended linens and kept a small stall of lessons in the market. The public record would make her life neat in a way that pleased clerks, manumitted, industrious, employed. But in the private tablet lay the names that the public record had not fully held. Those whose nights had been shifted away from predation, who had received a token, who had been guided to safer hands. The difference between the two records was the difference between being counted and being seen. At night, sometimes she would find Merritt or Zara at her bedside, their faces lit by the small wick, and they would trace letters on the curve of the bowl's rim. They would practice the curls that made an A, the dot that finished an I. These small shapes were small rebellions, symbols that could not be seized by any steward's hand. Catherine's life after manumission did not become a tale of triumph. It became instead an ongoing negotiation, a hope threaded through with caution, a series of small acts whose moral weight referred less to the law's absolutes than to the daily arithmetic of saving one name at a time. Her bowl remained on the shelf, a private testament. The private tablet grew thick with names and tiny marginal notes about where each woman had been placed and by whom. She hid the tablet in a seam that even a searching hand might not find. The steward, the clerks, the cotty, each played their roles in the unfolding of legal events. Each, too, held a private currency of motives. The clerks were not always cruel. Some were merely tired. The steward was not wholly indifferent. He valued order and disliked disruptions. Sophia, who had taught the art of concealment, kept saving what she could within the lines the system permitted.
Catherine learned from all of them, and in the learning she cultivated a life of small resistances that were not heroic spectacles, but rather persistent, soft forms of refusal.
The archival lesson came when an agent from the Cotty's office took a satchel of tablets to the public repository and tucked them into the shelf among other official records. The satchel's wax hardened and its seal cooled. The public ledger recorded transactions in a voice that insisted on clarity. But in a corner, tucked behind the official tablets, Catherine later discovered, by way of a clerk who owed a favor, an older, folded packet with names not written in the neat hand of the Cotty's clerks, but in a cramped, intimate script. It contained the names of the women who had taught novices how to fold linen, who had smoothed the creases of other people's lives, who had given deer hums in the dark. The packet was an unofficial record, a private archive hidden inside the public one. Catherine's private tablet and that hidden packet were two kinds of witness. One proved a legal change, the other preserved human particulars. The ledger could not speak of the way hands had steadied hands in the dark, or how a bowl had been passed between fingers, but the private records could. In the end, Catherine understood that the work of resisting the ledger's erasures would always be a twofold practice: to seek change in law where possible, and to keep memory where law would not. She continued to press seals for a living, to teach letters, to steer novices away from the sharpest entries. She collected deer hums and traded them for favors that could be spent like small miracles. She kept the blue bowl as a domestic altar to a life she had not chosen, but which she was determined to direct toward care. The public record would call her a free woman. The private record would say she had been an instrument of unexpected mercy. The steeple of a chapel, visible across the market, had once been a sight that opened Catherine's throat with longing. Under Mamluk control, under the layered authority of stewards and Cotties, the chapel's bells still rang for those who prayed. The ledger noted religious affiliation as a line item. It filed Christian women into categories that would determine the shape of their days. For Catherine, faith was not the language the ledgers used. It was a small interior script that shaped how she placed her name in the private tablet. She wrote a short prayer for each woman she protected, not as a doctrine, but as an act. May you be remembered. May your name be counted in life as it is counted in the ledger. What her life revealed was a quiet truth about how systems organize harm, that cruelty can be routinized until it appears reasonable, and that resistance often looks like the slow accumulation of favors, the careful shifting of a roster, the tender act of teaching a girl to write her own name. Catherine's acts did not overturn the ledger. They rendered it slightly less absolute. They made room for small survivals. When the Cotty's office sealed a folder of petitions and slid it onto the shelf with other official records, the clerk who pressed the wax did not know that the neat pile would one day be pried open by a woman who kept a tablet sewn into her shift. The public and the private moved together, sometimes in complement, sometimes at odds. Catherine's life was lived at that seam. She continued to sit by her lamp in the folding room, watching lamp oil smoke the edges of mirrors and listening to the soft sound of seals cooling on the bench. She kept teaching novices and keeping names. The bowl stayed on its shelf, its glaze a small, stubborn proof that a life could hold an object that meant ownership, but not ownership in law alone. A proof felt in the mouth of food, in the shape of a hand cupping soup,
in the small domestic rituals that made a life steady. There would be more petitions, more audits, more nights with names slipping near the ledger's teeth. Catherine would keep writing. She would keep swapping rosters and trading dirhams, and, when it was possible, producing the receipts and witnesses the Qati required for a small legal mercy. She learned that hope in such a world was not a single bright thing, but a practice. Keeping a bowl, writing names, leaving a folded note in the margin of a tablet so that someone later, perhaps a clerk with tired eyes and a memory of a favor owed, might read it and change the course of a life by a single, decisive note. The ledger would continue to bind and to classify, to make law and to make erasures. But Catherine had learned how to keep records that mattered in a different way. She had learned that to preserve someone's name was to assert their presence against a system that wished, by its very logic, to reduce them to numbers. She would keep doing this work, teaching, petitioning, hiding names in seams. It was not a grand rebellion. It was a life. The steward closed his ledger one evening and slid it into a shelf among other bound tablets. The wax of the seals had cooled. Outside, the market carried on. Fish sellers shouting their prices, children playing between barrels, the distant toll of a chapel bell. Catherine took her private tablet from its seam and added a name, then another, folding the tablet shut and tucking it where only she knew to look. The 3 doors stood, as always, between the quay and the inner rooms. They had closed and opened 100 times in her life. She had learned which creaks meant danger and which meant work. She had learned how to soften the sound of a closing door with the press of a hand. In the quiet that followed, she set the blue bowl upon her knees and touched its cool glaze with a forefinger, as if feeling for a seam in the world. The glaze was smooth. The bowl held no ledger's cruelty. In that small object she kept a proof that some things, despite the ledger's reach, might still be claimed as one's own. Outside, a clerk slid a fresh tablet, sealed and titled, onto the public shelf. Behind it, in a darker corner, the folded packet of unofficial names waited. Paper and ink that recorded what the law might ignore. Between the 2 records, Catherine continued to live and to make room for others, neither triumphant nor broken, only resolutely present. She had seen the shocking realities that the title suggests, the way law could render a life into a column, the way night duty could hide the forms of intimacy forced by power, the way a Qati's seal could decide the horizon of a woman's day. But she had also learned that within the same system lived the tools for small resistances. A ledger line smudged to hide a transfer, a seal pressed to record a favor, a bowl bought with a coin earned through a favor given. The shocking reality, then, was not simply cruelty alone, but the steady arithmetic of survival that required both compromise and care. Catherine folded her private tablet one last time that night and slipped it beneath the mattress. The world outside would go on making lists. Inside, names would be kept. She closed the blue bowl's lid and placed it upon the shelf, its glaze catching the lamp's light like a small, persistent memory. The steward's ledger rested in its place of authority. The private tablet and the hidden packet of names rested in the small archive of living hands. Both records mattered if memory was to outlast stamps and seals. When dawn came, Catherine would rise and fold linen and teach letters and press wax. She would keep adding names, one after another, to her folded record. She would continue to press the small resistances she had been given, the folkways to perform, shifting a roster, smoothing a hem, slipping a dirham into a waiting hand. She had no illusions about overturning the ledger. Her aim was narrower, quieter, to ensure that, in a world governed by seals and stamps, human lives remained visible to someone who would remember them. The ledger's pages would continue to be written, but somewhere between the wax and the folded tablet, Catherine had carved out a place where names could be remembered, where a blue bowl could hold more than simple food, and where a woman's quiet acts could alter the course of another's day. The public records would one day read manumitted, but the private records would read the fuller truth, a latticework of favors and small protections that, in their sum, were a kind of enduring resistance. And so she bent once more over her lamp, her fingers steady on the reed, the wax warm at her wrist, and added a new name to the list. The bowl on the shelf caught the light and held it. The 3 doors turned on their hinges. The steward pushed his ledger into its place. Somewhere a clerk closed a satchel and sealed it with a thumbprint.
Catherine moved through all of it, keeping the small rebellions closest to her chest, teaching others to write their names neat and small so that they might be remembered. Dawn found her at the basin. She folded the linen with the same fingers that had once smoothed a baptismal robe. The water smelled faintly of soap and barley. Beyond the lattice, the quay was awash of color and sound, carts creaking, a woman calling for her washed sheets, the steady thud of a cooper at his last hoop. Catherine wrapped the strip of cloth about the wax on her wrist and set the lamp in its bracket. She hummed a fragment of a tune a pupil had taught her, slow as the turning of pages. A soft knock came, careful as a pen's first stroke. Mara stood in the doorway, cloak drawn about her, cheeks hollowed by nights without full bread. In her hand she held a tablet, its seal crisp and official. Her eyes would not lift. Catherine took the tablet and read the stamped line, as one might read a hurt. A name, a tally, a mark that would send a man away at market and sell another's labor to settle a debt. She felt the ledger's weight settle like a stone in her stomach. "Not today," she said then, and the words were small and sure. She set the tablet beside her private packet, the blue bowl between them like a witness. While Mara watched, Catherine wet the reed, smoothed a margin, and with a practiced hand pressed a nick into the wax. Not to break the law, she knew, but to bend its shadow. She taught Mara the stroke that would make a clerk pause, the neat loop that read like a mother's first letter. When the steward's shadow passed across the shutter later, he found his ledger in order and the public shelf untouched. A transfer had been delayed by an error easily explained. Mara left with a loaf tucked beneath her arm, and the way of her shoulders changed by a single remembered hand. Catherine replaced the tablet, folded the linen, and carved another name into the private fold, one more presence kept from being counted only as debt. The bowl caught the returning light and held it like a promise. The 3 doors turned once more, and Catherine bent again over her lamp, the reed poised as if ready to write the world differently, line by careful line.